Tonight, I want to tell you about a century that almost no one remembers. Not because it was obscure, not because nothing happened. The opposite, actually. The world cracked along its oldest seams. Empires that had stood for generations dissolved into silence. Cities that had been drawing grain and copper and lapis from across hundreds of miles went quiet. Rivers that farmers had depended on since their great-grandparents were children stopped behaving the way rivers were supposed to behave. It happened around 2200 BC. And what makes it genuinely strange, what keeps archaeologists and climate scientists arguing about it in conference rooms centuries later, is that it didn't happen in one place. It happened everywhere that mattered: Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Syria, the highlands of Anatolia. Within the same rough window of time, the most sophisticated civilizations then alive went through some version of the same experience: contraction, fragmentation, collapse, or quiet, puzzling disappearance. The question of why is still, in certain essential ways, open. That is not a comfortable thing to say. We like our history to have causes. We like to know that one thing led to another, that the dominoes fell in a sequence we can trace. But the honest story of 2200 BC is more uncertain and more interesting than that. The evidence keeps arriving from different angles, from ice cores drilled out of glaciers that have never been disturbed, from sediment layers at the bottom of ancient lakes, from burnt clay tablets that scribes pressed words into before the palace above them caught fire. And the evidence keeps refusing to assemble itself into a single, neat explanation, which is, in a strange way, exactly why this story is worth sitting with on a quiet night. If you're listening to this because you need something slow and detailed to carry you towards sleep, that is what this is built for. There are 12 sections here, and each one moves into a different part of the ancient world. You don't need to remember all of it. The point isn't to memorize. The point is to travel. Before you drift off, leave a comment if you feel like it. Tell me where you are in the world and what time it is. I find those genuinely moving to read. Someone in Cairo at 2 in the morning. Someone in Vancouver folding laundry. Someone in Copenhagen lying in the dark. All of you listening to the same story about a world that thought it was permanent and turned out not to be. There is a word that appears over and over again in the archaeological literature for this period, and the word is interconnected. The ancient world of the 3rd millennium BC was not, as people sometimes imagine, a scatter of isolated civilizations, each sealed off from the others, bumping along in their own separate grooves. By 2300 BC, the connections were deep and old and had been tightening for centuries. Picture a tablet, just one. A clay tablet from a place called Ebla, in what is now northwestern Syria, dating to around 2400 BC. It is smaller than your hand. The writing pressed into it in neat wedge-shaped marks is cuneiform, the same basic system used in cities hundreds of miles to the east in Mesopotamia. The tablet records a trade transaction, wool going one direction, metal going another, something that sounds like an accounting entry for an olive oil delivery. Ordinary, bureaucratic, almost boring. Except that this tablet exists because Ebla, a Syrian city, was woven into the same commercial and administrative web as cities in Sumer. And because wool from Syrian shepherds was finding its way into Mesopotamian warehouses, and Mesopotamian copper was finding its way into Syrian workshops. And because a scribe in Ebla learned a writing system that originated far to the east and used it to record transactions that involve goods coming from far to the west. This is what interconnection actually looks like. Not some grand geopolitical statement, just a small clay record of goods moving between people who needed what the other had. By 2300 BC, those networks had grown astonishing in their reach. From the mines of Afghanistan came lapis lazuli, that particular shade of deep blue that ancient peoples seemed to find irresistible moving across the Iranian plateau through Mesopotamian trading cities and eventually into the workshops of Egyptian goldsmiths. From forests in Lebanon came cedar, dragged down to the coast and loaded onto ships bound for Egypt, which had almost no good building timber of its own. Copper from the island of Cyprus, from mines in Oman, from highland deposits in Anatolia, moved along routes that crossed deserts and mountain passes and stretches of open sea. Tin, the rare element that made bronze actually workable rather than just decorative, came from sources so distant that historians still argue about exactly where, possibly eastern Anatolia, possibly Central Asia, possibly somewhere else entirely. These goods didn't move themselves. They moved because people had figured out systems for moving them. Merchant families who maintained agents in multiple cities, palace and temple institutions that issued standardized weights so that a shekel of silver meant the same thing in Ur and in Mari and in Ebla. Scribes who wrote letters of credit and delivery receipts on clay tablets that could be carried as proof of obligation. Donkeys, thousands of them, loaded with bales of textiles or sacks of grain or ingots of metal, walking along routes that had been worn into the landscape over generations. The result was something that deserves more recognition than it typically gets: the ancient world's first truly international economy. And like any economy built on supply chains that stretch across thousands of miles, it had a fundamental vulnerability that almost nobody inside it would have had the framework to articulate. The same connections that made it rich made it fragile. If one part of the system strained, the stress didn't stay there. It traveled. Before we watch anything fall, we need to spend some time inside the world that existed, because the tragedy of 2200 BC is not just about what was lost in abstract terms. It is about what specific people had built and what they trusted, and what they woke up one morning to find was no longer reliable. Start in Egypt. Stand on the edge of the Nile at flood time, sometime around 2400 BC, a good 2 centuries before the crisis. The river has risen the way it always rises, fed by distant rains over the Ethiopian highlands and the equatorial lakes far to the south. The water is brown with silt. It has spread across the low fields on either side, and it is doing something extraordinary simply by existing. It is depositing the thin, dark layer of mineral-rich sediment that will, when the water recedes, make the soil so productive that Egyptians will call their country the Black Land. After that darkness, the state that had grown up to manage this system was, by 2400 BC, one of the most sophisticated administrative machines in the ancient world. The pharaoh at the top, divine in a specific and literal sense, understood to be the pivot between human society and the forces that controlled the flood. Below him, a hierarchy of officials who managed everything from the construction of massive stone tombs to the distribution of rations for workers to the recording of land ownership In every village along the river's length, the pyramids at Giza had already been built, the great ones, by this point. They would later strike people as evidence of some lost ancient technology, but they were in fact something simpler and in some ways more interesting, evidence of what an enormously efficient grain economy can accomplish when it is organized with enough patience and bureaucratic skill. Tens of thousands of workers, fed on a ration of bread and beer and dried fish, moving stone for decades. The logistics of this are, when you actually work through them, staggering. What made all of this work was a specific trust. The trust that the Nile would behave, that it would rise in the late summer the way it always had, that it would deposit its silt, that it would recede on schedule, that the taxes calculated on the previous year's flooding could actually be collected from the fields that the flooding had fertilized. When that trust began to erode, everything built on it became fragile. Now, travel east, across the Sinai, through the Levant, into Mesopotamia. The word itself means the land between the rivers, and that is literally what it was, a flat, almost rainless plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, which came down from the highlands of what is now Turkey, carrying snowmelt and mountain rain in their waters. On its own, this landscape was not naturally rich, but with canals, with irrigation systems maintained over generations by organized labor, the flat alluvial plain had been transformed into some of the most productive farmland in the world. The cities of Sumer had grown up on this foundation: Uruk, Nippur, Lagash. These weren't small settlements. Uruk, at its height around 3000 BC, may have held 30 or 40,000 people, making it one of the largest cities that had ever existed anywhere on Earth at that point. It had temples that rose story by story above the flat landscape, visible for miles. It had a whole class of professional scribes who had invented writing partly to keep track of the enormous flows of grain and labor that keeping such a city functional required. By the time of Sargon of Akkad, around 2334 BC, a new kind of power had emerged in Mesopotamia. Not just city-states negotiating and competing with each other, but something that genuinely deserved the word empire, a centralized authority that reached across the whole of Sumer and Akkad, that installed governors in cities that had previously governed themselves, that collected taxes from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast. Sargon's successors expanded it further, pushing into highland Iran, into Anatolia, into Syria. It was the first empire in history by most reasonable definitions, and it ran on grain, on irrigation, on a scribal system that tracked every delivery of barley and every labor assignment, on the assumption, deeply embedded in the theology as well as the economics of the time, that the system would continue to work. The Indus Valley is harder to describe precisely because we still cannot read its writing. The script that appeared on hundreds of small carved seals found at Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro and dozens of other sites has defeated every attempt at decipherment so far. We know the symbols exist. We know they recur in consistent patterns. We cannot yet know what they say. What we do know from the archaeology is that the Indus cities were doing something that their contemporaries in Egypt and Mesopotamia were not doing with anything like the same consistency: planning. Their streets ran in near-perfect grids. Their drainage systems were more sophisticated than what you would find in most European cities several thousand years later. Their bricks were baked to a consistent standard ratio across sites separated by hundreds of miles. Whatever institution or set of institutions was coordinating all of this, it was doing so with a kind of quiet, pervasive efficiency that leaves you slightly awed when you looked at the evidence. These three civilizations, Egypt along the Nile, Mesopotamia between its rivers, and the Indus world stretching across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, were the largest and most complex societies on Earth around 2300 BC. They were connected to each other and to dozens of smaller polities in the lands between them. They were, in the terms of their own time, permanent. The people inside them had every reason to believe they would go on indefinitely, because they had already gone on for so long. And then the century around 2200 BC arrived. Climate science can seem like it belongs to a different world than ancient history, full of ice cores and isotope ratios and proxy records and phrases like statistically significant anomaly. But every now and then, those technical tools produce a result that is blunt and startling enough to stop you. The 4.2 kiloyear event is one of those results. The term refers to a climate anomaly that appears in the geological record approximately 4,200 years ago, which is to say approximately 2,200 BC. Researchers found it first in cave formations called speleothems, the stalactites and stalagmites that grow in underground chambers as water percolates down through limestone. The chemistry of those formations is exquisitely sensitive to the amount of rainfall passing through the rock above them. When it is dry above, specific chemical ratios in the calcium carbonate shift in ways that can be measured precisely. What those measurements showed across cave formations from China to Oman to the central Mediterranean was a period of significantly reduced moisture, less rainfall, drier conditions, and the timing was remarkably consistent across sites separated by thousands of miles. Lake sediments told a similar story. Lake Van in eastern Turkey, the Dead Sea Basin, records from the Arabian Peninsula, deposits in the eastern Mediterranean, all showed evidence of falling water levels and increased evaporation around the same period. In some places, the signal was dramatic, in others, more subtle, but the direction was clear. And there was dust, ice cores from tropical glaciers, drilling down through layers that captured the atmosphere year by year, showed elevated concentrations of wind-blown mineral dust corresponding to this period. Dust in ice cores is generally a sign of dry, sparsely vegetated land surfaces where wind can pick up and carry fine particles long distances. More dust means more bare ground. More bare ground means less rainfall, was keeping vegetation alive and soil in place. Some researchers have estimated that in certain affected regions, average rainfall may have dropped by 20 or 30% for a period of 1 to 2 centuries, maybe longer in some areas, maybe shorter in others. The uncertainty is built into the nature of the evidence, but here is the thing worth sitting with before the science gets too abstract. A 20% reduction in annual rainfall sustained over 10 years, let alone 50, is not a weather inconvenience. For a civilization built on rain-fed agriculture in the Levant, or on a carefully calibrated flooding of the Nile, or on irrigation canals fed by rivers that themselves depend on upstream precipitation, a sustained decrease of that magnitude is an existential problem. You cannot tax grain that was never harvested. You cannot pay soldiers from empty warehouses. You cannot maintain the trust of farmers who have watched their fields fail 3 years running if you are the ruler whose divine mandate was supposed to guarantee abundance. What makes this genuinely difficult to sort out is that the 4.2 kilo-year event, if it happened more or less as the proxies suggest, did not hit everywhere equally. The records from the Near East, from Egypt, from parts of Central Asia are relatively strong. The signal in the Indus region is there, but more complicated, partly because the Indus world depended on monsoon rainfall patterns that are slightly different from the westerly systems affecting the Near East. Some parts of the world show almost no obvious signal at all. So it was not a uniform, global catastrophe. It was more like a regional drought of unusual severity and duration, affecting an arc of territory that happened to contain some of the most densely populated and politically complex societies on Earth. That specificity matters. It means that what we are trying to understand is not how drought destroyed everything, but how climate stress amplified pressures that were already building in systems that had been straining under their own weight for some time. Perhaps there are archaeologists who would push back even on that framing, who argue that the climate signal and the political collapses don't line up precisely enough in time to justify treating them as cause and effect. The evidence, they say, is suggestive, but not conclusive. Some collapses preceded what the climate proxies show. Some regions that should have been affected badly show archaeological continuity. The correlation is real, but correlation is not causation, and the ancient world was complicated enough that 100 local factors could account for what looks, from 4,000 years away, like a single synchronized catastrophe. That uncertainty is not a failure of the science. It is an honest reflection of how hard these questions are. We are trying to reconstruct the internal dynamics of civilizations that left fragmentary records using physical proxies that capture climate imperfectly across timescales, where a few decades of error can make a cause look like a consequence or a coincidence look like a connection. What I find interesting to sit with is the question of what the people inside those civilizations understood of what was happening to them. They had no concept of a global climate event. They had no framework for thinking about the chemical composition of cave formations or the relationship between Nile flood height and Indian Ocean sea surface temperatures. What they had were the specific, immediate experiences of fields that wouldn't yield, canals that ran lower than expected, prices in the market that kept rising, officials who kept demanding taxes that felt increasingly impossible to pay. They explained those experiences through the frameworks they had. The gods were displeased. The king had failed in his ritual obligations. Some moral or religious failure had inverted the proper order of things. The laments written down later in Sumerian and Egyptian and other scripts speak in those terms of cosmic disequilibrium, of a world turned upside down. What they were describing, imperfectly and through their own cultural vocabulary, was real. The hardship was real. The hunger was real. The political disintegration that followed was real. The distance between their explanation and ours is not that we know the truth, and they were simply ignorant. It is that we have different tools and are asking slightly different questions. They were asking why the gods had abandoned them. We are asking whether a weakened monsoon system contributed to agricultural failure. Both questions are reaching toward the same underlying events, just from very different angles. The Akkadian Empire did not fall in a day. No empire does, really, whatever the later chronicles might suggest. The collapse of the first empire in history was a process that unfolded across decades, and like most political unravelings, it involved a mixture of things going wrong simultaneously in ways that each made the others worse. By around 2250 BC, Akkad, under the king Naram-Sin, was at its greatest formal extent. Royal inscriptions from this period are breathtaking in their confidence. Naram-Sin called himself King of the Four Corners of the Universe. He had temples built to himself while still alive, which was unusual and significant, a statement that the king had crossed from the merely extraordinary into the divine. His campaigns pushed into territory that previous Akkadian kings had only raided. What you rarely see in those inscriptions is any acknowledgement of difficulty. Royal inscriptions were not designed to record difficulty. They were designed to project strength. But the difficulties were there, documented in other ways. Agricultural records from the same period show fields in parts of northern Mesopotamia being abandoned. Not all at once, not in a pattern that screams of sudden catastrophe, but gradually, holdings shrinking, certain districts producing less, the texture of the land changing in ways that the central administration was trying to track and couldn't quite manage. Archaeologists excavating sites in the Kaaba Triangle, the region in what is now northeastern Syria, that had been one of the most densely settled agricultural zones in the ancient Near East, have found evidence of a dramatic population decrease in the late 3rd millennium BC. Towns that had been thriving went silent. The pottery sequence just stops at a certain level, then resumes much later with different vessels, suggesting different people, or perhaps the same people living very differently. Some of the abandonment looks like it happened fast. Other sites show a longer deterioration. The patterns are not uniform, which is one of the things that makes this so hard to reduce to a single explanation. If it were purely drought, you might expect a more consistent signal across the landscape. The fact that some areas seem to have been hit harder than others suggests that local factors, the specific drainage of a particular valley, the management of a specific irrigation system, the political relationships between a specific city and its hinterland, were shaping how the stress landed. The Akkadian state was also, by this point, stretched in ways that made it harder to absorb shocks. Maintaining governors in dozens of cities across a vast territory required money, which required taxation, which required surplus. When surplus shrank, the demands on the parts of the empire that still had something to give became heavier. Heavier demands bred resentment. Resentment bred rebellion. Rebellion required military response, which drained resources further. The cycle, once started, had its own terrible logic. There is a particular Akkadian text that circulated for centuries after the empire's fall, copied and recopied by scribes who found it useful for some purpose we can only guess at. It describes the fate of a city, possibly Akkad itself, in the aftermath of what it presents as divine punishment. The text says that the crops produced only half a cubit, where they should have produced 2/3 of a cubit, that the rains turned to drought, that the fish of the deep waters retreated to their depths. that wild animals forsook the fields that had once sheltered them. Whether that text is remembering a real specific famine, or whether it is using the language of agricultural failure as metaphor for political failure, is genuinely unclear. Probably both at once. Sumerian and Akkadian literature rarely drew sharp lines between cosmic, political, and agricultural disorder. They were all, in the worldview of the time, expressions of the same underlying condition, the breakdown of the proper relationship between the divine order and the human world. What the text is certainly remembering is a sense of profound wrongness. A world that had been familiar and reliable, revealing itself as suddenly, terrifyingly contingent. Around 2193 BC, the last king of the Akkadian dynasty disappears from the records. The name of the man who replaced him as ruler of at least part of Mesopotamia suggests he was from the Gutian peoples, a highland group from the Zagros Mountains to the east. Later, Mesopotamian tradition would describe the Gutian period as a dark age, a time when kingship was confused, when no legitimate dynasty sat on the throne, when the land was given over to chaos. How much of that is historical, and how much is propaganda written by later kings who wanted to emphasize the disorder that preceded their own glorious restoration, is hard to say. The Gutians themselves left almost no written records, which is part of why they appear in later sources as shadows, destructive, uncivilized, defined entirely by their relationship to the order they disrupted. What is interesting to think about is the question from their perspective, or from any pastoral and highland group's perspective. For generations, those groups had existed at the margins of the Akkadian system, sometimes raiding, sometimes trading, sometimes serving as mercenaries. The empire controlled the productive plains, taxed the flows of goods, maintained garrisons that kept the balance. When the empire weakened, the balance shifted. Peoples and groups that had been kept peripheral were suddenly able to move differently through the landscape. Whether this looks like invasion or opportunity depends entirely on where you are standing. The Nile always rose. That was the axiom at the heart of Egyptian civilization, as deep and old as any religious belief. The river would swell every year in late summer, carry the dark silt down from the Ethiopian highlands, flood the fields, recede. The fields would be planted. The harvest would come. The state would take its share. The temples would take theirs. And the farmers would keep enough to get through to the next flooding. For centuries, that cycle had been reliable enough to build the most sophisticated, centralized state in the ancient world on top of it. The Old Kingdom, as historians call this period, had developed administrative structures capable of organizing tens of thousands of workers, tracking grain across enormous distances, maintaining ideological coherence through an elaborate system of royal ritual and funerary theology. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was the guarantor of the flood. His rituals maintained the proper relationship between the human world and the cosmic order that kept the Nile predictable. What happens to that ideology when the Nile stops being predictable? The evidence for what happened to Old Kingdom Egypt around 2200 BC is both rich and frustratingly ambiguous. On one hand, the sequence of kings becomes difficult to follow. The long, stable reigns of the 4th and 5th dynasties give way to a period where rulers seem to succeed each other quickly, where the historical record becomes confused, where the machinery of centralized royal administration appears to seize up. Pepi II, the last major ruler of the Sixth Dynasty, is traditionally credited with a reign of more than 90 years, which, if accurate, would make him the longest reigning monarch in human history. Whether that number is precisely right or not, the historical record does show a long, apparently stable reign followed by a period of rapid fragmentation that historians call the First Intermediate Period. Within a generation or two of Pepi II's death, something like 30 kings may have ruled Egypt. The country that had been unified under a single pharaoh for centuries splintered into competing regional powers. There are later Egyptian texts that describe this period in terms that are clearly distorted by distance and purpose, but that seem to carry some echo of real experience. The Admonitions of Ippur describes a world turned upside down. The poor have become rich, and the rich poor. The river runs with blood. Foreigners are everywhere. Grain cannot be found. The land is in chaos. These texts were written and rewritten long after the events they seem to describe, and they were shaped by literary conventions that used images of social inversion to express moral and political disorder. You cannot read them as straightforward news reports, but they reflect a cultural memory of a period when the reliable patterns that Egyptian civilization depended on stopped being reliable. The climate evidence for reduced Nile flooding during this period is, like so much of the evidence for the 4.2 kilo-year event, suggestive rather than definitive. The Nile's flood levels depend on rainfall over the Ethiopian highlands and around the equatorial lakes. If monsoon patterns weakened across the broader region, as the speleothem and lake sediment records suggest, it is reasonable to expect that Nile inundations would have been reduced and variable. There are some historical records of unusually low floods from this general period, though dating them precisely is difficult. What would low floods have meant in practice? The flood deposited silt and moisture. Too little flood, and the fields at the higher elevations of the inundation zone would not have been reached by the water, leaving them dry and unfertilized. Too low a flood year after year would mean shrinking agricultural output. Shrinking output meant less surplus to tax. Less surplus meant less to distribute to the army, the craftsmen, the priests, the workers on royal building projects. The whole machine would slow, then sputter, then in some departments stop. It's interesting to think about the political psychology of this moment. The pharaoh's legitimacy was built explicitly on his role as the maintainer of cosmic order, the one whose rituals kept the flood on schedule. When the flood failed repeatedly, that claim became harder to sustain. Provincial governors, called nomarchs, who had for generations administered their regions as loyal agents of the crown, would have faced a choice: continue to send their region's surplus to a weakened center, or redirect those resources to local use, to defending and feeding the people actually living under their administration. The evidence suggests many chose the latter. Nomarchical tombs from the First Intermediate Period show these regional rulers increasingly presenting themselves not as royal officials, but as local patrons. They boast on their tomb walls of feeding their people during famine years, of protecting their districts from neighbors, of maintaining local order when the center could not. They are doing what provincial administrators always do when the center weakens. They are becoming the center. This is not necessarily cynical or treasonous in the way the later royal literature implies. In conditions of genuine scarcity, concentrating resources locally rather than shipping them to a distant capital that may not be able to provide anything in return is a rational response to a real problem. The tragedy, if it is a tragedy, is that it dissolves the shared structure that made Egypt more than the sum of its individual river districts. By around 2160 BC, there were effectively two competing centers of political power in Egypt, one in the north around Heracleopolis, one in the south centered on Thebes. They would compete for the better part of a century before a Theban dynasty reunited the country and proclaimed the Middle Kingdom. In the long view of Egyptian history, the first intermediate period is a gap, a troubled interlude between more stable eras. But for the people living through it, it was simply what the world was. The Nile eventually resumed normal flooding. The climate, whatever exactly it had done, moderated. The irrigation systems held together well enough that agriculture continued, reduced and disrupted, but not destroyed. Egypt recovered, rebuilt, found new forms for its old ideas. What is perhaps most striking about the Egyptian case is how much survived. The language continued. The religious traditions continued, in modified forms. The basic techniques of agriculture and administration were passed along through the difficult decades. When the Middle Kingdom kings reunified the country, they were drawing on a deep reservoir of cultural continuity that the first intermediate period had stressed but not emptied. That reservoir might be the most important thing to understand about what collapse actually means in an ancient context. It very rarely means total erasure. It almost always means transformation under pressure. The Indus civilization is in some ways the most mysterious of the ancient collapses because it is the most silent. In Egypt, we have royal inscriptions, lament texts, administrative records that stretch across the period of transition and allow us to trace the voices of people who lived through it. In Mesopotamia, we have king lists and legal documents and the occasional scribe who recorded something close to an eyewitness account. In the Indus Valley, we have something different, a script that no one has yet managed to decipher, and a material culture so consistent across such a wide area that it feels almost like a civilization that preferred not to leave the kind of record that later people could easily read. What we do have is archaeology. The physical evidence of what happened to the Indus cities is, in some respects, clear, and in other respects, it raises questions that the evidence alone cannot answer. The mature Harappan urban phase, the period of the grid-planned cities with their standardized bricks and sophisticated drainage, reached its height somewhere in the middle centuries of the 3rd millennium BC. Mohenjo-Daro, the largest known site, may have held 40,000 people or more. The city was rebuilt multiple times on its own accumulated ruins, the streets relaid in the same grid pattern, the drainage channels maintained and cleaned. There is something in that consistency that suggests a very strong commitment to a particular way of organizing urban life, whether through central authority or through deeply embedded cultural norms, or some combination of both. Then, sometime in the late 3rd millennium and early 2nd millennium BC, the pattern changes. The upper levels of Mohenjo-Daro show a different character. Buildings are subdivided where they were once more open. Craftsmanship in some areas becomes less precise. The great drains are partially blocked, The uniform brickwork gives way in places to cruder construction, and eventually the city is no longer occupied. But here is the thing that complicates any simple narrative of collapse. The people didn't vanish. The archaeological evidence shows populations moving, specifically eastward, into the upper Ganges-Yamuna plains, into the foothills of the Himalayas, into regions that had previously been more lightly settled. The Harappan cultural tradition, in reduced and modified form, persists in smaller sites across a wide area. What collapsed was not civilization in general, but a particular configuration of urban life. The big planned cities, the long-distance trade, the standardized material culture that had made the Indus world recognizable across such a vast geography. Why? Some historians and archaeologists focus on the rivers. The Indus system is fed by glacial meltwater and monsoon rainfall, and there is evidence that major rivers in the system shifted their courses during this period. The Ghaggar-Hakra, often identified with the Sarasvati River, described in later Indian texts, appears to have lost its permanent glacial-fed character and become a seasonal river, eventually drying up entirely in its lower reaches. For cities and farming communities built along its banks, that would have been a slow but inexorable catastrophe. Water that you depended on, that had been there for generations, becoming first seasonal, then unreliable, then absent. The 4.2 kilo-year event and the Indus world is a more complicated case than Egypt or Mesopotamia because the South Asian monsoon system operates differently from the westerly weather patterns that dominate the Near East. The proxy records for monsoon strength around 2200 BC are mixed. Some suggest a weakening, others are ambiguous. What seems clearer is a longer-term change in the distribution and reliability of monsoon rainfall that played out over several centuries, rather than in a single, sharp episode. What makes this interesting to think about is that the Indus cities, for all their sophistication, may not have had the intensive irrigation infrastructure that Mesopotamia had. They seem to have relied more on natural flooding and seasonal rainfall. That makes them in some ways more vulnerable to shifts in when and where the monsoon delivers its water. You cannot compensate for a failed rain through clever management of a canal system if you do not have the canal system in the first place. There is also the question of disease. Dense urban populations sharing water sources and living in close quarters create conditions in which infectious diseases can spread rapidly. The human skeletal remains from late Harappan contexts show some individuals with signs of violence and others with evidence of diseases that cause significant physiological stress. Whether epidemic disease played a role in the Indus decline is, again, one of those questions where the evidence allows for the possibility but does not confirm it. And there is trade. The Indus connection to Mesopotamia was real and documented. Mesopotamian texts refer to merchants traveling to or from a place called Meluha, now generally identified with the Indus world. Indus carnelian beads have been found in Mesopotamian burial contexts. When the Akkadian Empire weakened and the political order in Mesopotamia became less stable around 2200 BC, the commercial relationships that had tied the two regions together would have been disrupted. For Indus cities that had developed specialized craft production partly in service of long-distance exchange, losing that market would have been an economic shock on top of whatever environmental stresses they were already managing. The Indus story is in the end a story of durbanization rather than catastrophe. The cities thinned, the populations dispersed into smaller, more flexible settlements. The great standardizing force that had given the mature Harappan culture its distinctive consistency fragmented into regional variations. Life continued, adapted, found new shapes. But the specific form of civilization that had flourished along those rivers for centuries was gone. What is striking about that process is how little obvious violence appears in the archaeological record. No mass graves suggesting epidemic or massacre. No thick destruction layers indicating conquering armies. The Indus decline, whatever caused it, appears to have been largely a process of people making decisions. To move, to farm differently, to live in smaller communities, closer to reliable water sources. Those decisions, accumulated across thousands of families over several generations, produced what looks from our distance like the collapse of a civilization. From the inside, it may have felt more like the gradual realization that the old way was no longer working, and the slow, practical work of finding a new one. The lands between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean were, by the mid-3rd millennium BC, something like the nervous system of the ancient world. Not the largest or the most powerful regions individually, but the territory through which connections ran, through which goods and information and people moved when they needed to pass from one great civilization to another. Syria and the Levant contained their own cities, of course, with their own substantial histories. Ebla in northwestern Syria had been a major trading center with archives of clay tablets running into the tens of thousands. Mari on the middle Euphrates controlled river traffic and overland routes between Syria and Mesopotamia. Smaller centers dotted the landscape from the coast to the steppe margin, each positioned at some productive intersection of routes or resources. The zone was rain-fed in a way that both Egypt and southern Mesopotamia were not. In the best years, winter rains from the Mediterranean and westerly systems swept inland, enough to fill cisterns and water grain fields and keep the steppe margins green enough for grazing animals and the people who moved with them. In the worst years, those same systems failed or shifted northward, leaving fields dry and springs low, and the careful balance between farming communities and pastoral groups suddenly much harder to maintain. The evidence for what happened around 2200 BC across this zone is more archaeologically detailed than the picture is for Egypt or the Indus, partly because the region has been more extensively excavated, and partly because the destruction, where it occurred, was sometimes dramatic enough to leave clear physical evidence. At Ebla, there is a destruction layer that matches roughly this period. Rooms full of pottery smashed and scattered, walls collapsed, charred timbers. The whole picture of a wealthy administrative center meeting a violent end. For a long time, this was attributed to the military campaigns of Naram Sin of Akkad, the Akkadian king who boasted of conquering far distant lands. Whether that specific attribution is correct, or whether the destruction has a different cause, remains debated, but the destruction itself is real. Across wider northern Syria and the upper Euphrates, settlement surveys have detected a pattern of site abandonment. Hundreds of small agricultural villages that appear in the 3rd millennium record simply stop showing pottery in later levels. The land does not become uninhabited, but the character of occupation changes, thins out, becomes more mobile and less rooted. Some historians suggest that what we are seeing is a shift from settled farming communities toward a more pastoral and semi-nomadic mode of life, a response, possibly, to unreliable rainfall that made grain farming on the margins too risky and herding a more prudent investment of effort. This pattern of shifting between agriculture and pastoralism in response to climate variability is documented in the historical record in many regions and times. It leaves a distinctive archaeological signature: fewer permanent sites, smaller sites, more evidence of mobile groups, the arrival of pottery styles associated with herders rather than farmers. The Amorites are the historical label attached to groups that were entering the settled Mesopotamian world from the west and northwest during this period. In later Mesopotamian texts, they are described with barely disguised contempt: people who don't know grain, who eat raw meat, who don't build proper houses, who don't bury their dead according to proper rites. The contempt is instructive. It tells you that the people writing those texts were genuinely alarmed by the presence of these groups and were processing that alarm through cultural condescension. What were the Amorites actually? Almost certainly not a single coherent ethnic or political group. The word probably covered a range of Semitic-speaking pastoral and semi-pastoral peoples from the steppe and hill country to the west, people who had always existed at the margins of the irrigated core and who moved into different relationships with the settled world depending on conditions. When the settled world was strong and well organized, they traded with it, worked for it, raided its edges. When the settled world weakened, they entered it more assertively, filling political vacuums, taking titles, eventually founding dynasties. Several centuries after the period we are discussing, the great first dynasty of Babylon was Amorite in origin. The Amorite movement was not the end of anything, but the beginning of something new, a transformation of the political landscape rather than its destruction. But in the immediate term, around 2200 BC, the combination of reduced rainfall in the rain-fed zone, political disruption cascading out of the Akkadian collapse, disruption to trade routes, and the increasing assertiveness of pastoral groups made the Levant and Syria a difficult place to maintain complex, settled life. Cities that had been nodes in a thriving exchange network found themselves cut off from their suppliers and customers. Governors who had derived their authority from a distant imperial center found that authority evaporating. Local leaders had to make do with what was immediately available, which was often much less than they were accustomed to. The picture that emerges is not of sudden total destruction, but of something more complex and in some ways more interesting: reorganization. Some urban centers contracted dramatically, but persisted. Others were abandoned, but their populations relocated rather than disappeared. Some areas that were less dependent on long-distance trade or less exposed to the specific stresses of the period show more continuity. The Levantine coast, with access to maritime routes and to diverse resources from the sea and the mountains and the hinterland, may have weathered the disruption better than the more exposed inland plains. What collapsed was the specific configuration of the late third millennium, the densely connected network of cities, the long supply chains, the imperial frameworks that had given the whole system its stability and its dynamism. What survived was the human capacity to continue living and organizing communities in new and smaller and more locally rooted ways, while the conditions for something larger slowly reassembled themselves. In the highlands that curved around the northern and eastern edges of the ancient Near East, something different was happening. Not collapse in the same sense, not the dissolution of palace economies and scribal administrations, something more like a redistribution of possibilities. The mountains mattered to the great river civilizations in a specific, practical way. They were the source of almost everything that could not be grown or made on flat alluvial land. Copper came out of highland mines. Tin, the rare ingredient that made bronze workable, came from somewhere in the highlands, though exactly where is still debated. Good building timber came from highland forests. Certain kinds of stone came from mountain quarries. The animals that provided motive power for caravans, the donkeys, and eventually the horses, were bred and traded through highland channels. The relationship between the river valley civilizations and their highland margins had always been a negotiation. Sometimes the negotiation took the form of tribute when an imperial army made the arrangement clear with a display of force. Sometimes it took the form of trade, genuinely voluntary exchange of highland products for lowland grain and manufactured goods. Often it was somewhere between, exchange made slightly less voluntary by the implied alternative of compulsion. When the Akkadian Empire was at its height, it could project enough force into the highlands to maintain something like stable tribute relationships. Governors were installed, garrisons established, trade routes patrolled. Highland chiefs had calculations to make about the relative cost of compliance versus resistance, and for most of the imperial period, compliance was the more rational choice. As Akkad weakened, those calculations changed. Garrisons became smaller and less reliable. The cost of non-compliance dropped. Local highland leaders who had been constrained by the threat of imperial military response found themselves with considerably more room to maneuver. Some took advantage of that room to impose their own tolls on trade routes. Others seized territories that had previously been under lowland control. Some of them, like the Gutians, appear in Mesopotamian records as invasive disruptions. Others, further up in the highlands or across the Iranian plateau, simply become invisible. They continued doing what highland communities had always done, but without the interaction with lowland empires that had left records. The archaeological picture in the highlands around 2200 BC is one of active change rather than destruction. Pottery traditions shift, sometimes quite rapidly. Settlement patterns reorganize, with some lowland adjacent sites contracting while certain hilltop and valley locations show evidence of increased activity. There are more fortified sites, more elaborate burial assemblages in some areas, suggesting that wealth and status were being expressed differently as the old lowland connection loosened. What is interesting to think about is the question of agency. In the standard narrative of ancient history, the highlands tend to be portrayed as either suppliers to the great civilizations or threats to them, rarely as actors with their own trajectories. But the people who lived in the Taurus Mountains, the Zagros, the ranges of what is now Iran and Armenia, were making decisions about how to live and how to organize themselves that had their own internal logic, not just reactive responses to whatever the lowlands were doing. when the lowland demand for copper fell, because the palace economies that had generated that demand were contracting. Highland mining communities didn't simply stop. They found other outlets, other customers, new regional networks that didn't pass through Akkad or Memphis. Some of the regional exchange systems that became prominent in the early 2nd millennium BC, connecting Anatolia with the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean, were built in part by highland communities that had reorganized their connections during the period of lowland disruption. The collapse of an empire always creates a vacuum, and vacuums have a way of being filled. Not always immediately, not always comfortably, but filled nonetheless by those who are positioned to take advantage of new configurations. The highland peoples of Western Asia in the late 3rd millennium were among those positioned to gain from the reconfiguration of the network, even as the Great Valley civilizations struggled. There is something almost cyclical about this pattern, recognizable across many periods and places. The great integrating empires that pull highland resources into their orbits, the inevitable fraying of that relationship under stress, the assertion of highland autonomy, and then, after enough time, the emergence of new lowland powers that begin the cycle again. Understanding where 2200 BC sits in that cycle is part of what makes it more than just a moment of crisis. It is a moment of reorganization, the painful and uncertain passage between one configuration of the world and another. The goods that held the ancient world together did not move by themselves. They required systems, not the abstract systems we mean when we talk about economic systems, but specific, tangible, physical arrangements, standard weights, carrier animals, contractual documents, protected routes, trusted agents in distant cities. By 2300 BC, those systems had been developing and refining for centuries. The result was something that looked from a distance almost like a modern international trading network, though built from entirely different materials and sustained by entirely different institutions. The standard weights are among the most quietly remarkable objects in the archaeological record of the ancient Near East. They are small, often shaped like animals, ducks or lions or coiled serpents, or simply geometric forms, and they were manufactured to a consistent mass that traders, merchants, and palace officials from Ur to Ebla would have recognized. Carry a duck-shaped weight in your hand, and you hold something that says, "I am participating in a system of exchange that extends beyond this city. My transaction can be verified by anyone who has the same set of standards." The texts that documented those transactions survive in their hundreds of thousands. Clay tablets record the movement of specific quantities of wool and textiles from Mesopotamian cities to the east, toward markets in the Iranian plateau and beyond. Other tablets trace the movement of metals in the opposite direction. Still others record the lending of silver at interest, the formation of trading partnerships, the arbitration of disputes between merchants who had made commitments that one of them felt the other had not honored. Reading those texts is strange and affecting because the concerns they record are so recognizable. A merchant worrying about whether his agent in a distant city is managing his funds honestly. A temple official calculating whether the expected returns on an investment justify the risk. A farmer borrowing grain to get through until the next harvest and pledging his field as security. The specific goods and the specific currencies and the specific institutional forms are ancient and unfamiliar. The underlying human anxieties are not. These networks depended on something that is easy to underestimate because it is invisible in the archaeological record. Trust. A merchant who sent a shipment of copper ingots from a highland source toward a lowland city was making a bet that when the goods arrived, they would be received by someone who would honor the agreed price or exchange. That bet required faith in the institutional frameworks, the palace or temple that guaranteed the transaction, the scribes who recorded it, the officials who enforced contracts, the gods who were invoked as witnesses. When those institutional frameworks weakened, the trust that depended on them eroded. This is one of the mechanisms through which political collapse becomes economic crisis. It's not simply that tax revenues drop or armies can't be paid. It's that the whole architecture of confidence that makes long-distance trade possible starts to look unreliable. Merchants become more cautious. Routes that seemed safe become questionable. Investments that seemed reasonable become uncertain. The system that had been self-reinforcing with each successful transaction, making the next one easier to arrange, goes into reverse. There is textual evidence from the late Akkadian period of exactly this kind of erosion. Letters between merchants and their agents express anxiety about whether deliveries will be made, whether debts will be honored, whether certain routes are still safe. The tone is different from earlier texts in the same genre. More uncertain, more explicitly worried about things that had previously been taken for granted. Commodity prices are another window into this process. When supply chains break down, the prices of imported goods rise. When they rise enough, the craftsmen and palace workshops that depended on those goods have to adapt, using less metal, substituting cheaper materials, recycling old objects rather than producing new ones. The material culture shows these changes. The great bronze working traditions of the late 3rd millennium don't vanish overnight, but the quality and quantity of metal in elite burials and temple deposits shifts in ways that suggest tighter supply. At the same time, some local traditions intensify. When you can't import the good stuff, you work harder on what you can make from local resources. Ceramic traditions in some regions become more elaborate right around the period of network disruption. Perhaps as potters and their patrons channeled effort and prestige display toward what was available rather than what was now inaccessible. What is remarkable about this process, viewed over the long term, is how much of the knowledge survived the disruption. The techniques of bronze casting, the administrative practices of taxation and record keeping, the astronomical knowledge encoded in Mesopotamian astronomical texts, the engineering skills embedded in irrigation systems. Almost none of this was lost. It was carried forward through the difficult decades by scribes and craftsmen and administrators who kept practicing their skills even as the political and economic superstructure above them shuddered and reorganized. This is part of what makes the category of collapse so complicated. The network contracted. The flow of goods slowed. Some cities shrank or were abandoned. Some political authorities dissolved. But the knowledge that had accumulated over centuries persisted, largely intact, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to be applied at scale again. The question of what conditions those were, what allowed the network to start rebuilding itself, is one of the most interesting in the history of the ancient Near East? And the partial answer is the same kinds of local institutions that had allowed people to manage at smaller scales during the disruption. The temple communities that had maintained their ritual functions even when the palace superstructure above them was in chaos. The family networks of merchants who had maintained their trust relationships on a smaller geographic scale. The farmers who had kept their fields going, even at reduced productivity, even with changing crops. These were the seeds of whatever came next. Water is the most patient teacher. It doesn't demand anything immediately. It just keeps coming, or it keeps failing to come. And eventually, the landscape arranges itself around whatever it does. The people of ancient southern Mesopotamia understood this in their bodies, in the inherited knowledge of generations, in the way their fathers' fathers had built the diversion channels, and the farmers ahead of them had learned which fields were safest to plant in a dry year. They did not have the vocabulary of salinity gradients or soil chemistry, but they knew in the practical, accumulated way that farming peoples know things, that the land was changing, that some fields which had once produced reliably were now less dependable, that the crop that had dominated the landscape was gradually, in many areas, being replaced by a different one. The change from wheat to barley in ancient Mesopotamia is one of the most carefully documented ecological transitions in the ancient world. It appears in the administrative records, which were detailed enough to track what was being grown and in what proportions on the various estates managed by temples and palaces. In the early 3rd millennium, wheat and barley were both important crops. By the late 3rd millennium and into the 2nd, barley increasingly dominates. Wheat becomes rarer, then in some records nearly absent. The reason is salinity. Barley can tolerate salt concentrations in the soil that kill wheat. As centuries of irrigation without adequate drainage allowed salt to accumulate in the root zone of fields, wheat struggled and barley endured. This is not a sudden collapse. It is a slow substitution, almost imperceptible from year to year. But over generations, it meant that the most productive and most versatile crop of the early civilization was being squeezed out by a hardier but less flexible one. Archaeobotany, the study of plant remains from archaeological sites, has confirmed this pattern in multiple locations across southern Iraq. The charred seeds preserved in excavated layers from different periods tell the story clearly. More barley, less wheat, a creeping adjustment to deteriorating soil conditions. What is interesting about this story is what it reveals about the relationship between environmental change and civilizational stress. The salinization of southern Mesopotamian fields was not primarily caused by the 4.2 kilo-year event. It was a longer-term problem, building over centuries of irrigation agriculture, the slow accumulation of salt left behind by evaporating water. But it was a problem that became more acute under conditions of political and economic stress, because maintaining the drainage systems that could have leached salt from the soil required organized labor on a substantial scale, and organized labor on a substantial scale was exactly what was becoming harder to mobilize as the Akkadian Empire weakened. The tragedy of the salt problem is that it was not, in principle, unsolvable. Flushing large quantities of water through fields to dissolve and drain the accumulated salt is a technique that farmers in the ancient world understood and sometimes applied. But it required more water than normal irrigation, and it required investment of effort at a time when surplus labor was being absorbed by military campaigns and political crises, and the basic difficulty of maintaining essential infrastructure in conditions of political fragmentation. In stable times, the imperial organization that had forced through massive irrigation and drainage projects was a burden that felt heavy. When that organization weakened, the immediate experience was one of reduced demands, fewer corvée obligations, less grain hauled to distant capital cities. But the long-term consequence was that the maintenance work stopped getting done. Canals silted, drainage channels clogged. The fields slowly deteriorated in ways that took years to become visible and decades to become catastrophic. This is a pattern worth dwelling on because it recurs in so many contexts. The benefits of a complex central organization are diffuse and long-term. Maintained infrastructure, regulated resource use, the ability to mobilize coordinated responses to problems that require coordinated responses. The costs are immediate and concrete. Taxes, corvée labor, submission to authority you didn't choose. When the authority weakens, people experience relief from the concrete costs before they experience the consequences of losing the diffuse benefits. By the time the consequences are visible, the capacity to restore the organization may have been lost. In southern Mesopotamia, around 2200 BC, the salt problem was one of the invisible costs of the Akkadian collapse. The cities of Sumer were not burning. People were not starving in immediately dramatic ways. But the land was slowly becoming less able to support the populations that had grown up depending on it, and the institutional capacity to do something about that was simultaneously contracting. What made some cities survive better than others in this environment was often simply location. Cities on the main channel of the Euphrates had access to more water, which meant they could flush fields more effectively. Cities on secondary channels that were silting up had less. Cities in regions where the natural drainage was better could maintain soil quality more easily than those in lower, flatter terrain, where water table rise was a constant problem. The cities that survived into the early second millennium, that became the seeds of the next phase of Mesopotamian civilization, were not necessarily the largest or the most powerful of the Akkadian period. They were the ones that happened to be in the right relationship with their physical environment when the conditions change. There is something almost arbitrary about that, which is hard to accept when you are trying to find a story with clear causes and clear consequences. But the arbitrariness is real. A city's survival into a subsequent era often depended on factors that had nothing to do with the quality of its administration, or the wisdom of its rulers, or the value of its culture. It depended on whether it was a few feet higher than its neighbors, whether its particular canal happened to maintain adequate flow, whether salt levels in its agricultural hinterland happened to stay below the threshold at which barley too would begin to struggle. History, even ancient history, is full of this kind of contingency. The grand structures of empire and civilization, impressive as they are, rest ultimately on very specific and sometimes quite fragile physical foundations. The wrong rainfall in the wrong place, sustained for long enough, can do more damage to a political order than any military campaign. When an empire thins out, the people who lived under it don't dissolve with it. They go somewhere. They do something. They make decisions about how to survive in a landscape that has suddenly become more dangerous and less predictable. And those decisions, accumulated across thousands of families and hundreds of communities over decades, produce a kind of movement that leaves its own traces in the archaeological record. The migrations associated with the late 3rd millennium BC are not the dramatic, clearly purposeful marches of armies or the carefully planned colonizations that show up in the later periods. They are more diffuse and more human than that. People moving toward water when their local water source failed. People seeking relatives in cities that seemed more stable. Young men joining the retinues of local strongmen when the old imperial employer stopped paying. Herders extending their seasonal grazing routes into territories that the now absent garrisons could no longer protect. Farmers following rivers upslope as the lower elevation fields became too salty or too unreliable. The result was a general shift in the distribution of population across the ancient Near East, from the exposed and marginal zones toward the more reliably productive ones, from the flat, heavily irrigated alluvium toward the river valleys and Piedmont zones, where water was closer to the surface and soil quality more consistent. From densely connected, intensively maintained urban nodes towards smaller, less interdependent, more locally self-sufficient communities. From the outside, from the perspective of a scribe in a surviving city watching people arrive from disrupted regions, this looked like chaos. Foreigners filling the same cities, familiar places emptying out, the old hierarchies of place and production disrupted by movements that no single authority was directing or even fully aware of. From the inside, from the perspective of the families doing the moving, it looked like survival. The calculation was not abstract. It was, this field is failing. This city is increasingly difficult to feed. This route is no longer safe. What do we have? And where can we take it? And who do we know that might help us when we get there? The kinship networks that connected ancient communities across distances were one of the most important and least documented mechanisms of crisis management in the ancient world. Extended family ties, marriage alliances, long-term relationships between pastoral groups and the cities they traded with. These connections created webs of obligation and support that could be activated in times of difficulty in ways that the formal institutions of palace and temple could not always replicate. His merchant family with members in multiple cities had options when one city became unstable, redirect operations through the branch in a safer location, draw on credit relationships established in better times, call in obligations from partners who had been beneficiaries in previous years. A farming family with a cousin who had married into a community up the Euphrates had somewhere to send a son when the local harvest failed. These informal networks were the social equivalent of the drainage channels that preserved fields from salinization, invisible when things were going well, desperately important when they stopped. The Amorites, those groups from the steppe and semi-arid margins of the Levant, who feature so prominently in Mesopotamian texts of this period as a kind of threat or disruption, were in many ways simply the most visible expression of this larger pattern of movement. They moved because the land they had been using, the seasonal pastures of the Syrian steppe, had become less reliable. They moved toward the irrigated cities because the irrigated cities still had water and grain, and because the political frameworks that had kept the boundary between steppe and sown field firmly maintained were weakening. The contempt expressed for them in Mesopotamian texts, the descriptions of people who don't know proper food or proper burial or proper building, is the reaction of an urban population to the arrival of people with different habits and different priorities, people whose economy and culture and relationship to the landscape had been shaped by very different conditions. It is also the reaction of a population that feels its own stability threatened by the movements of others, that sees in the arrival of unfamiliar groups the evidence of its own vulnerability. Within a few generations, the descendants of those despised arrivals would be sitting on the thrones of major Mesopotamian cities, writing their own royal inscriptions in Akkadian, building their own temples, maintaining their own versions of the administrative traditions that their grandparents had supposedly disrupted. Transformation, not replacement. New people participating in old structures, and in the process changing both themselves and the structures they had entered. This is how civilizations actually absorb crisis, not by preserving themselves unchanged, but by incorporating the pressures that threaten them, by making room, however reluctantly, for the movements and the peoples that the crisis sets in motion. There is a question that hangs over this whole period, and that different historians answer very differently. Were these collapses connected? Was there a single force, a climate event, or a systemic shock to trade networks, or some combination that tied together the struggles of Egypt and Mesopotamia and the Indus and the Levant into something that deserves to be called a single crisis? Or is the apparent synchronicity an illusion created by the roughness of our dating, by the fact that when you are working with margins of error measured in decades, events that happened a century apart can seem simultaneous? Honestly, the evidence doesn't settle this cleanly. What I find myself thinking is that both framings contain something true, and that the tension between them is itself illuminating. The climate event was real. The proxy records, taken together across their individual limitations and ambiguities, point to a genuine period of reduced moisture affecting a wide arc of territory in the late 3rd millennium BC. That event did not cause everything that followed, but it was a multiplier, a force that took whatever vulnerabilities already existed in specific political economies and amplified them beyond the point where normal adaptation could compensate. At the same time, each regional collapse had its own specific character shaped by local conditions, local institutions, local choices. Egypt's crisis was not Mesopotamia's crisis, was not the Indus Valley's process of transformation. The mechanisms were different, the timescales were different, the outcomes were different. Egypt reconstituted itself as a unified state within a few generations. Mesopotamia went through a complex period of fragmentation and reorganization before the second dynasty of Lagash, and then the Ur III dynasty reasserted something like imperial organization. The Indus world found different forms of life but did not reconstitute its great urban centers. What ties them together is not a single cause, but a shared moment of exposure, a moment when the systems that had been managing stress broke down, when the buffers ran out, when the accumulated pressures from multiple directions converged. Each civilization had been building up vulnerabilities in different ways: soil degradation in Mesopotamia, over-centralization in Egypt, dependence on long-distance trade networks that turned out to be less stable than they appeared. The climate event was the thing that pushed enough of those vulnerabilities past their threshold simultaneously. If you remove the climate event from the story, you can tell plausible accounts of each regional collapse that don't require a single shared cause. Each one would have faced its own version of crisis eventually. But the coincidence of timing, the fact that so many different systems hit their limits within the same rough century, suggests that something was pushing them all at once, even if it pushed them in different directions and with different force. Perhaps the most honest framing is this: the 4.2 kilo-year event was not the cause of the Bronze Age collapse of the late 3rd millennium. It was the occasion. It provided the additional stress that revealed how much the existing systems had already been straining, and it did so across enough of the connected ancient world simultaneously to prevent any one region from absorbing another's shock. That distinction between cause and occasion is important because it points toward what the real vulnerabilities were: the rigidity of palace economies, the fragility of long supply chains, the dependence of political legitimacy on environmental conditions that no ruler could actually control. Those vulnerabilities were built into the structure of these civilizations over the centuries of their development. The climate event didn't create them. It just made them impossible to ignore any longer. And this is perhaps the most quietly unsettling thing about 2200 BC. Not that civilizations fell, but that they fell in ways that nobody inside them had seen coming. Not because they were foolish or careless, but because the vulnerabilities were genuinely hard to see until the moment of stress revealed them. The Akkadian Empire was the most powerful political institution that had ever existed. Egypt's administrative system was the most sophisticated in its region. The Indus cities were, by many measures, the best planned urban environments in the world. None of that was enough, not when the rain stopped coming the way it was supposed to. The century after 2200 BC was, across most of the ancient Near East and beyond, a period of rebuilding. Not rebuilding in the triumphant sense of reconstruction planned and executed according to a clear design, but rebuilding in the more uncertain, groping sense of communities, trying things, seeing what worked, discarding what didn't, gradually finding new equilibria. In Mesopotamia, the Ur-3 dynasty emerged from the political complexity of the post-Akkadian period as a new kind of imperial project. Its rulers drew lessons, consciously or unconsciously, from what had happened to Akkad. They were more systematic about canal maintenance. They were more careful about how they managed the relationship between the central state and local institutions. The records they left are extraordinarily detailed, running to hundreds of thousands of tablets, ration lists, animal inventories, labor records, grain accounts. The attention to documentation has the quality, reading it now, of people who had learned that what was not recorded was what was lost. The Ur-3 state was also, in various ways, more brutal than its predecessors about enforcing labor obligations and maintaining control. The degree of administrative micromanagement visible in its records is striking. It is as if the lesson learned from the Akkadian collapse was: control everything, document everything, leave nothing to chance or to the discretionary judgment of local officials. That lesson had limits. The Ur-3 dynasty lasted about a century, from around 2112 to 2004 BC, and its end came from a combination of factors that included drought, external pressure from groups including the Amorites and the Elamites from the east, and internal strain from the sheer cost of maintaining such an elaborate administrative machine. The laments composed after its fall are among the most affecting pieces of ancient literature. Detailed, grief-stricken accounts of cities abandoned, temples desecrated, people scattered. But the fall of Ur III, painful as it was not a return to the confusion of the post-Akkadian years. It was a transition to a different kind of political order, a patchwork of city-states and small kingdoms, some of them with Amorite rulers, that maintained enough of the Mesopotamian administrative and cultural tradition to allow the eventual emergence of the Old Babylonian period, and within it the reign of Hammurabi, who reunified Mesopotamia in the early second millennium. Egypt's Middle Kingdom, which emerged from the first intermediate period under the Theban dynasty, was in many ways a more self-aware and philosophically reflective state than the Old Kingdom had been. The literature of the Middle Kingdom shows evidence of a civilization that has thought about what happened and is trying to incorporate that thinking into its self-presentation. The anxiety is right there in the texts, royal inscriptions that dwell more explicitly on the obligations of rulers to their people, on the possibility of failure, on the need for humility before forces that no king fully controls. It is the literature of a civilization that knows from experience that the Nile can fail. The Indus world's recovery, if that is the right word, is harder to trace because the earlier urban civilization left no deciphered texts, and the later traditions that emerged in its territory seem to represent genuine discontinuities rather than simple continuation. The late Harappan and post-Harappan phases show communities with different material cultures, different economic orientations, different relationships to the landscape. Something genuinely new was being built out of the components of what had come before, but the architecture was different. What is interesting about all these recoveries is how much they owe to what survived the crisis. The physical knowledge of how to build canals and manage fields, the administrative traditions of record-keeping and taxation, the metallurgical skills of bronze casting, and the agricultural knowledge of how to manage irrigation. All of this persisted through the difficult decades. It was carried by individuals and small communities and temple institutions that maintained their practices even when the larger political structures above them had fragmented. This points to something important about what civilization actually is beneath the impressive surface of its empires and monuments. It is accumulated knowledge distributed across thousands of people who practice specific skills and maintain specific traditions. That knowledge is more durable than any political structure, more resilient than any particular dynasty or empire. The civilizations of the ancient Near East have been accumulating it for centuries, before 2200 BC, and they continued accumulating it in the decades after. Their empires rose and fell. The knowledge persisted, which is perhaps one of the reasons why the early second millennium BC, the period that emerged from the disruptions of the late third, was in many ways as remarkable as anything that had preceded it. New political forms, new trade networks, new cultural syntheses. The Old Babylonian period produced Hammurabi's law code, one of the most sophisticated attempts to codify human social relations in the ancient world. The early second millennium Egyptian Middle Kingdom produced some of the greatest literature in the Egyptian language. New trading networks in Anatolia, connecting Assyrian merchants to Anatolian cities, created something close to a genuinely competitive commercial market, documented in spectacular detail in the archives from Kanesh. The world that emerged from the crisis of 2200 BC was not the same as the world that preceded it. It was, in many ways, more diverse, more decentralized, more experimentally varied. The great monolithic empires of the late third millennium, for all their impressive scale, had in some ways suppressed the local variation that now bloomed in their absence. The patchwork of city-states and small kingdoms that characterized the early second millennium allowed different institutional forms, different political experiments, different ways of organizing the relationship between rulers and ruled to develop in parallel. That diversity turned out to be its own kind of strength. When the next major disruption came, much later, the ancient Near East was a more complex and varied landscape than it had been before the crisis. The patterns that appear in 2200 BC are not unique to that period. They recur. They have recurred across the entire span of human history, in different places, with different specific causes, but with recognizable family resemblances. Complex societies built on stable environmental conditions develop vulnerabilities over time. Their infrastructure ages, their administrative costs rise, their supply chains lengthen, their political legitimacy becomes more contingent on maintaining conditions that no political institution actually controls. When the environment shifts, or when a combination of stresses accumulates beyond what the system's buffers can absorb, the complexity that had seemed like strength reveals its hidden fragility. What happens after such a crisis also follows recognizable patterns. The disruption is real and painful, and for some communities and some individuals, it is catastrophic. But most of the knowledge and most of the population survive, and what emerges on the other side is not nothing. It is a new configuration, shaped by what the crisis revealed about the old configuration's vulnerabilities, building on what persisted, and often more diverse and experimentally varied than what preceded it. This is not a comfortable story in one sense. It offers no guarantee that any particular civilization, any particular way of organizing human life, will survive any particular crisis. The Indus cities are gone. The Akkadian Empire is gone. The Old Kingdom is gone. The specific forms they had found for human flourishing did not make it through the crisis intact. But in another sense, it is a more hopeful story than simple catastrophism. The knowledge survived. The people found new ways. The capacity to organize complex societies, to maintain irrigation systems and diplomatic relationships and administrative traditions, to build cities and maintain records, did not disappear with the empires that had hosted it. It went underground for a while, maintained at smaller scales and with less visibility, and then it grew again. There is something worth sitting with in the recognition that the civilizations we study as ancient history were, from their own perspective, contemporary and permanent. The scribes who pressed cuneiform into clay tablets were not writing for us. They were recording the present, the utterly normal and ongoing present of their own time. The farmers who watched the Nile floods carefully were not historical figures going through a historical crisis. They were people worried about next year's harvest. And somehow, across all the disruptions and contractions and reorganizations of the centuries around 2200 BC, enough of what they had built and learned and practiced made it through to the other side. Not unchanged, not intact, but present in modified and distributed forms in the institutions and practices of the civilizations that came after. The Akkadian scribal tradition fed into the Ur-3 administrative system, which fed into Old Babylonian law and literature, which fed into the Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires, which fed into the traditions that influenced, at several removes, the world you are living in. The Egyptian administrative and artistic traditions that survived the first intermediate period shaped the Middle Kingdom, which shaped the New Kingdom, which shaped the late period, which intersected with the Greek and Roman, and later medieval worlds in ways whose ultimate consequences are still unfolding. The Indus world's specific urban tradition did not continue, but the genetic and cultural populations that had lived in those cities were the ancestors, partially, of the populations that later produced the Vedic traditions and the many layers of South Asian civilization. The disruption was real. The continuity was also real. What 2200 BC shows, held at this distance, is how resilient the human project actually is. Not invulnerable, not immune to catastrophe or capable of maintaining any specific form indefinitely, but genuinely resilient, capable of finding new expressions even after severe disruption, of maintaining something essential through periods when everything visible seems to have collapsed. Perhaps what this whole story is really about is the texture of endings that aren't quite endings. When we say the Akkadian Empire collapsed, we mean something specific. The royal administrative structure, centered in Akkad, ceased to function. The provincial governors stopped reporting to a central authority. The Akkadian king stopped being the organizing principle of political life across Mesopotamia. That is real. It happened. But the farmers of Nippur went on farming. The scribes of Ur went on pressing words into clay. The merchants of the Tigris-Euphrates system went on moving goods on a smaller scale and with different partners, but moving them. The gods of Sumer continued to be worshipped in temples that had been active since long before Sargon. The technical knowledge of irrigation management, accumulated over centuries, remained available in the minds of the engineers and canal overseers who had spent their lives learning it. Collapse in the ancient world, and perhaps in general, is the death of one configuration, not the death of everything that configuration contained. The configuration matters, genuinely. The loss of the specific achievements of the Akkadian Empire or the Old Kingdom is a real loss. Specific knowledge, specific artistic traditions, specific forms of political cooperation that would have to be slowly rebuilt or would never quite be rebuilt in the same form. But underneath those configurations, something more durable persists, something that no particular empire or dynasty can fully claim credit for, because it belongs to all of them and none of them. The accumulated practical wisdom of people who have been figuring out how to live in a specific landscape for a very long time, how to manage this particular reach of river, which fields hold water and which drained quickly, where to look for the first sign of the flood, how much barley you need to store to get through a poor year. What do you say to your children about why you do things the way you do? That knowledge is not glamorous. It doesn't build pyramids or carve law codes or found empires. But it is the actual foundation that empires rest on. And it is what remains when the empires are gone. The world around 2200 BC was full of people carrying that knowledge, continuing to apply it even as the institutional frameworks above them shook, and in some cases fell apart. The historians who study this period sometimes call them the people without history, because they left no inscriptions, no royal records, no monuments with their names on. But they were the reason anything survived. I find that genuinely moving to sit with, not in a way that requires sentimentality or false comfort. The difficulties were real and for many people devastating, but in the way that the quiet persistence of ordinary human competence across any crisis is moving. People kept planting. People kept digging canals. People kept teaching their children how to read the signs of the flood. And eventually, out of that quiet persistence came the next thing. Whatever the next thing was, wherever you are listening to this right now, you are somewhere on the long downstream of 2200 BC. Every administrative tradition, every writing system, every legal framework, every agricultural technique that contributed to the civilization you live in carries something inherited from the ancient Near East, however many times removed and transformed. That inheritance is not a cause for pride or shame, really. You didn't do anything to earn it, and you couldn't have avoided it even if you tried. It is simply the condition of being a person alive at this particular point in the long story of how humans have organized themselves on this planet. What the story of 2200 BC offers, if it offers anything beyond historical knowledge, is a certain perspective on the fragility and the persistence of complex arrangements. The things we build are not permanent. The conditions we depend on are not guaranteed. The systems we trust are vulnerable in ways we cannot always see from inside them. But the knowledge we accumulate is more durable than any of those systems. The practical understanding of how to live together and manage shared resources and maintain the traditions that make a community recognizable to itself across generations. This has survived things that looked, from the inside, like total catastrophe. This is not a comforting thought in a cheap way. It doesn't mean that no crisis is serious or that everything always works out. Some things that were lost in 2200 BC were genuinely lost. Specific cultural traditions that had no equivalent, specific forms of knowledge that were embedded in institutions that did not survive, specific ways of living and building and expressing meaning that the world has not seen since. But it does mean that the story isn't over when the empire falls. It is just being told differently, in smaller voices, through different channels, with different words. The Nile is still there. The Tigris and Euphrates are still there, diminished and changed by centuries of human use, but present. The highland sources of copper and tin that fed the ancient world's bronze networks are still there, long since worked out, but there in principle, the seams that the ancient miners followed still visible in the rock if you know where to look. And we are still here. asking the same questions the people of 2200 BC were asking, or something recognizably like them. What caused this? What can we do? What will remain? The rain had failed. The floods had come too low. The supply chains had seized. The political orders had fractured. And yet people kept farming, kept writing, kept caring for their dead and their children and their gods and their fields. And eventually, the rain came back. Not the same rain, not falling in exactly the same places or in exactly the same amounts, but rain. And the world began again, as it always does, in the first pale light of a morning after a long night, uncertain and provisional, and full of the same basic human needs that the previous morning had held. If you are still with me, settle deeper. Let the images of ancient cities and silted canals and lake sediments and clay tablets fade into the background of whatever your mind wants to drift toward. The past is very long, and most of it was quiet. Farmers watching weather, scribes pressing marks into wet clay, children learning what the adults around them knew. The disruptions stand out because they are the exceptions. The persistence is harder to see because it is ordinary, continuous, everywhere. Somewhere tonight, above a city that didn't exist 4,000 years ago, but that sits on land that was farmed 4,000 years ago. The sky is doing something. Rain or stars or overcast or the thin early light of a coming dawn. The same sky that the Sumerian astronomers watched. The same patterns that Egyptian priests tried to read for signs of the coming flood. Most of the people who have ever looked at that sky are gone now, their names unrecorded, their specific thoughts permanently inaccessible. But they were there, and they looked, and some of what they understood is still with us. Carried forward through so many hands, it is impossible to trace the chain, but present nonetheless. That chain includes tonight. It includes you, wherever you are, whatever time it is, listening to the long, slow echo of a world that almost broke and then went on anyway. The canals are still there in the dust. The fields were replanted. The stories kept being told. Rest now. The history will keep until morning. There is something that the clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia reveal almost accidentally in the gaps between the formal records. The scribal schools of Sumer and Akkad trained boys, mostly boys, through a curriculum that included copying texts of every kind: hymns, laments, mathematical exercises, lexical lists, cataloguing words for trees and fish and stones and professions. Some of those exercises survive because the students made errors and the teachers corrected them, and the tablets were discarded in rubbish pits where they lay for 4,000 years before excavators found them. What those discarded student tablets tell us is that knowledge in the ancient world was transmitted through something very close to what we would recognize as formal education. Not universal, certainly not egalitarian, but systematic in the sense that there were established texts to be learned, established sequences to be followed, established standards of correctness that a student's work was measured against. This is worth thinking about when we consider how ancient civilizations managed to transmit their accumulated knowledge across the disruptions of the late 3rd millennium BC. The scribal tradition was not only a tool of palace administration, it was a culture with its own prestige hierarchy and its own sense of what mattered. Scribes trained in the system had a stake in the continuation of the system that went beyond any particular political employer. If the palace of one city fell, A scribe trained in the cuneiform tradition might find employment in another city or in a temple, or as a private administrator for a wealthy merchant family. The texts they had learned to copy didn't belong to the empire. They belonged to the tradition, and the tradition was remarkably portable. You carried it in your head, in your trained hand, in your memory of how to shape each sign in the sequence of hundreds that the full cuneiform script required. That was not something that any military defeat or political fragmentation could simply remove. The same is true, in different ways, of the agricultural knowledge embedded in farming communities across the ancient Near East. The knowledge of when to plant, how much water a specific field needed at a specific time of year, which seed varieties performed better in which conditions, how to repair a damaged canal bank without disrupting water flow to fields downstream. All of this was practical knowledge distributed across tens of thousands of farming households. No palace owned it. No scribal system documented most of it. It lived in practice, in the habitual movements of people who had learned their craft from parents, who had learned from theirs. That distributed, embodied knowledge is both more vulnerable and more resilient than the formal knowledge preserved in archives. More vulnerable because it dies when the community that holds it disperses, when the land it is adapted to is abandoned, when the specific conditions it evolved for change beyond the point where the old practices work. More resilient because it doesn't depend on any particular institution, any particular political authority, any particular building or archive. As long as some people keep farming the same land in the same general way, the knowledge persists. The crisis of 2200 BC disrupted both kinds of knowledge transmission in different ways. The palace archives of the Akkadian Empire are gone, destroyed, or simply not preserved in contexts where excavators have found them. Some of what they contained was preserved through the scribal tradition, copied into later archives in Ur and Nippur and other cities that maintained continuity. Some of it was simply lost. The specific administrative details of how Akkadian provincial management worked, the specific formulas for imperial correspondence, some of the specialized vocabulary of the imperial system. These faded from the record without being preserved. The agricultural knowledge is harder to trace. Archaeobotany and paleoecology give us some windows into what crops were grown and how farming practices changed across the period of disruption. But the detailed, locally specific knowledge of specific farming communities, whether this particular field drained better if you dug the secondary channels slightly to the north, how much earlier you needed to plant in a dry year to beat the worst of the summer heat, which varieties of barley held up better when the irrigation water came late. That knowledge either survived in the communities that continued farming the same land, or it didn't. If it didn't, later farmers had to relearn it by experience, at cost. This is one of the hidden costs of the disruptions of 2200 BC that does not show up in the obvious archaeological record of collapsed buildings and abandoned cities. The loss of locally adapted knowledge, of the fine-grained expertise that accumulates over generations of people working the same specific landscape. The new communities that settled in previously abandoned areas after the disruptions, or that settled areas that had been farmed by different groups, had to develop that expertise from scratch. They got there eventually, But the getting there took time and involved failures that the previous inhabitants, with their accumulated knowledge, might have avoided. This is one reason why the aftermath of ancient collapse periods often shows lower agricultural productivity per unit of land than the preceding periods, even when the land itself is in reasonably good condition. The knowledge that made the land productive was partly specific to the people who had worked it. When those people went away, some of what made them effective went with them. It is also one reason why the subsequent recovery was often associated with the return or persistence of at least some elements of the original population, people who carried residual knowledge of how to work the specific landscapes they were returning to or continuing to inhabit. The Mesopotamian agricultural recovery of the early second millennium was built in significant part by people whose grandparents had farmed Mesopotamian fields, working with techniques adapted over generations to Mesopotamian conditions. The knowledge survived, distributed, partial, imperfect, but present enough to provide a foundation for what came after. When we tell the story of ancient collapse, we tend to focus on the great centers, the capital cities, the palace archives, the royal inscriptions that mark the beginning and end of dynasties. But the centers are only part of the story. Sometimes, maybe even often, the margins are where the more interesting things are happening. The northern Syrian steppe, in the late 3rd millennium BC, was one of those margins. Not the heartland of any empire, not the location of the most impressive cities, not the source of the most detailed written records, but a zone of interaction where farming communities and pastoral groups and caravan routes and the political projections of city-states from multiple directions met and negotiated their coexistence. In the 3rd millennium, when the Akkadian Empire was strong, that negotiation was mediated by imperial power. The state defined who could graze where, who owed tribute to whom, which routes were under which authorities' protection. The pastoral groups of the steppe existed in a defined, if sometimes contested, relationship to the settled world. When the empire weakened, the mediation disappeared. The negotiation became direct. Farming communities and pastoral groups facing each other without an overarching authority to arbitrate their competing claims on the same water sources and the same seasonal grazing areas. This is a situation that can go badly in obvious ways, with raiding and conflict and the abandonment of farming settlements that can no longer be defended. It can also, sometimes, go in surprising directions. The mixed communities that emerged in some parts of the Levant and Syria during the transitional period of the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia were not simply the result of pastoral groups conquering farming communities. They were the result of people with different subsistence strategies, finding that they needed each other. The farmers providing stored grain and access to well water, the herders providing animals and access to networks that stretch beyond the local horizon. Some of the political entities that emerged in this zone during the early 2nd millennium were explicitly mixed in their composition. Leaders with pastoral backgrounds who had learned to present themselves in the vocabulary of urban kingship, cities with populations that included long-term agricultural families and more recently settled pastoral groups, economies that combine irrigated farming with animal husbandry in proportions that previous, more specialized economies had not attempted. These mixed economies were in some ways more resilient to the kind of climate variability that had stressed the more specialized systems of the late third millennium. If the rain failed in a particular year, a community with significant pastoral resources could draw down its animal herds to compensate for reduced grain yields. If the pastures dried out, a community with established irrigation infrastructure could divert more water to keeping the herds alive. The diversification was not foolproof, but it created more options. That is perhaps the deepest lesson of the 2200 BC period, if it has one. Not that complexity is bad, or that simpler systems are better, but that resilience requires maintaining more than one strategy, more than one resource base, more than one way of responding to a world that does not always behave as expected. The most successful communities that emerged from the disruptions of the late third millennium were not the ones that had been most purely optimized for the conditions that preceded the crisis. They were the ones that had, for whatever reasons, maintained a degree of flexibility, a diversity of options, a surplus of adaptive capacity that allowed them to find new configurations when the old ones stopped working, and the lesson travels forward. Through the subsequent disruptions of the second millennium and the first, through the Bronze Age collapse of around 1200 BC, which would be even more dramatic in some regions, through the fall of Rome and the fragmentation of the medieval world and the upheavals of the early modern period, the same basic pattern recurs. The systems built for one set of conditions run into conditions they were not built for, and what survives is what had maintained enough flexibility to find a new shape. The ancient world of 2200 BC was full of such flexible communities, small enough to be overlooked in histories that focus on empires, important enough that their persistence made possible everything that came after. They are the ones we owe the most to, and the ones whose names we will never know. The rain came back. That is perhaps the most important single fact about what followed 2200 BC. The climate anomaly that had compressed rainfall across a wide arc of the ancient world was not permanent. The proxy records that show the drying also show, eventually, a return toward more normal moisture levels. The lakes that had fallen began to fill again. The speleothem records that had shown reduced isotope ratios shifted back. The worst of it seems to have lasted perhaps a century or two. Though regional patterns varied, and some areas experienced longer periods of disruption than others, but a century is a very long time in human terms. A century is 4 or 5 generations. It is long enough for the children born at the beginning to die of old age before the end, long enough for the social institutions that have been disrupted to either find new forms or to be forgotten, long enough for landscape patterns established under crisis conditions to have taken on the quality of normal, to have become what the current generation understood as simply how things were. When the rain came back, the world that received it was not the world that had existed before the drying began. It was a world that had been through something, that had reorganized its population distribution and its political institutions and its agricultural practices in response to conditions that were now changing again. The new conditions were in some ways better than the crisis conditions, but they did not simply restore the previous arrangement. You cannot step into the same river twice, as the saying goes, and you cannot step back into a civilization that has gone through a century of stress as if the stress had not happened. What the returning rain found across the ancient Near East and its associated regions was a landscape of new possibilities. New political centers that had emerged during the disruption now had established positions and were not going to simply dissolve back into pre-crisis arrangements. New agricultural patterns that had adapted to more variable conditions maintained some of that adaptability even when conditions improved. New trade networks that had been forged to work around the disrupted arteries of the late third millennium had their own logic and their own participants who were invested in continuing them. The world that emerged into the second millennium BC was not better or worse than the world that had preceded the crisis of 2200 BC. It was different, more varied in some respects. The political landscape of the early second millennium is, when you look at it carefully, more complex and more experimentally various than the late third millennium had been. More different kinds of polities, more different forms of organization, more different ways of answering the basic questions of how to manage agricultural resources and political authority and long-distance exchange. The diversity is, in retrospect, part of why the second millennium produced such an extraordinary range of cultural achievements. The literature of the old Babylonian period, the diplomatic correspondence of the early second millennium Near East, already showing something close to an international system of recognized sovereign states. The Minoan civilization of Crete, which was partly built on the disrupted and reorganized trade networks of the Eastern Mediterranean. The emergence of early alphabetic writing, developing in the Levantine zone that had been one of the most disrupted regions of the 2200 BC crisis. The extraordinary intellectual and artistic production of the Egyptian Middle Kingdom. None of these achievements can be simply credited to the crisis of 2200 BC. They had their own specific causes, their own internal logics, their own histories that extend in every direction, but they were all shaped by the world that emerged from the crisis, a world that had been shaken loose from some of its older, more rigid configurations, and that was in the process of finding new ones. This is perhaps the most human thing about the story of 2200 BC. Not the scale of the crisis, not the impressive sophistication of the civilizations that were disrupted, but the simple fact that people kept going. They kept farming and writing and building and arguing and making art and telling stories and figuring out how to feed their children. They did these things in changed circumstances, with reduced resources, facing uncertainties that their parents had not faced. And out of that stubborn, ordinary persistence, something new emerged. The tablets are still in the ground, most of them. The cities are still there, buried under centuries of accumulated debris, waiting for excavators who have not yet arrived. The sediment cores that hold the climate record are still being drilled from lake beds and cave systems. Every few years, a new study adds detail to the picture, refines the timeline, complicates or confirms the existing understanding. The story of 2200 BC is not finished. It is still being told, still being discovered, still being argued over by people who care deeply about understanding what happened and why. That is its own kind of persistence the persistence of the questions themselves across the millennia. Somewhere in a museum, a clay tablet pressed 4,000 years ago records the transfer of grain from one account to another. The scribe who pressed it into wet clay with a reed stylus lived through something, some version of what this story has been describing. They probably didn't know they were living through history. They were just doing their job, keeping the record that the institution required, making sure the accounting was accurate. The institution they worked for is gone. The language they wrote in requires specialist training to read. The grain they recorded has long since been eaten or rotted or turned to dust. The tablet is still there. Sleep well wherever you are tonight. The record keeps.